My name is David Lee Summers, and I'm reading an excerpt from the story The Sun Worshipper, which appears in Afterpunk, published by E-Spec Books. Dianella Stanton had a rapport with the dead. She couldn't explain it, and didn't necessarily want it, but she could feel spirits and channel their voices. When Professor Augustus Herriman invited her to a mummy unwrapping party, she couldn't resist. She had known many wealthy people around London who had acquired mummies from Egyptian expeditions and hosted unwrappings. She so wanted to go to one. Much as spirits frightened Dianella, they also fascinated her. She had never encountered a spirit as ancient as that belonging to a long-dead Egyptian pharaoh. She wondered how long they lingered and what secrets they could impart. She followed Harriman's butler, Talbot, down the hallway to the parlor. She had never met the professor before and wondered what possessed him to invite her. Nevertheless, a thrill of excitement fluttered through her and lightened her steps. Talbot announced her, and Dianella bristled as she realized the parlor was filled with scientists, all of whom had slandered her at one time or another. Near the punch bowl stood Martin Mitchell, a chemist with slicked-back hair who once said the spirit voices that spoke during her seances were made by an accomplice behind a curtain. At the buffet, toad-like Nigel Pogson chatted with Desmond Llewellyn, who once said she used wires to lift tables. Ornithologist Maurice Swift caught her eye, then dared snort a laugh as his eyes shot away. He once said she accomplished spirit writing with her feet. All those statements the scientists had made about her were patent lies. Her fists clenched and unclenched. She began to suspect Herriman invited her to be mocked by these cretinist chemists, astronomers, and biologists. She steeled her nerves and continued into the room, curiosity about the mummy driving her forward despite her irritation. Fortunately, she didn't have to wait long. Soon, curtains parted, and a man with a full beard and a mop of black hair rolled out a wooden gurney on squeaky wheels. A blanket covered what appeared to be a body. The scientists fell silent, and all eyes turned to the gurney. The man introduced himself as Professor Herriman. "Thank you all for attending." The professor moved behind the gurney so he could address the audience. "As many of you know, I recently acquired the mummy of one Prince Nefera from an associate in Egypt. His name means the good of the sun god. Shall we meet our sun worshipper?" He grabbed the corner of the blanket and paused to make sure he had everyone's attention, then yanked it away, revealing the mummy underneath. "Fake?" All eyes fell on Dianella, but she couldn't help herself. "Fraud!" she cried. She knew what mummies should look like. The bandages should be brown and ancient, nearly falling to dust. The bandages on this mummy were white and new, as though they'd come from a modern hospital. Her worst fears now seemed justified. Professor Herriman had indeed invited her just to make a fool of her. "I say," croaked Professor Pogson, "your mummy doesn't look very ancient at all." Dianella appreciated that someone else in the room also seemed taken aback. Herriman handed the sheet to his butler. "Please, please, I do not intend to deceive." He held his hands out over the mummy. "This is a real mummy. I have taken the liberty of unwrapping it in the privacy of my laboratory and conducting some studies before this public event." To what end? Maurice Swift leaned forward and narrowed his skeptical gaze on his colleague. All will soon be made clear. Herriman glanced down at the body before him. I assure you, I have conscientiously rewrapped the mummy, returning the artifacts where I found them. Without further ado, the professor began unwrapping the mummy, handling it with great care. Talbot rolled out a trolley and placed it next to the professor. Below the first layer of bandages, he revealed an elaborate collar of gold and polished coral. He placed it on the trolley. He unwrapped another layer and came to a pair of amulets. One looked like a cross with a loop at the top. He declared it an ankh, a symbol of life. The other amulet looked like the English letter A. Harriman explained that it was a plummet, which would bring balance to the deceased. Dianella walked up to the trolley and examined the amulets. They looked genuine. She tried to reach out and touch them. Love and pride of artisans long dead rolled off them, setting her hand tingling. She stepped back, blinking and wondering why the professor perpetrated this elaborate hoax, wrapping real artifacts in such obviously new wrappings. Professor Mitchell stepped up beside her and retrieved a monocular from his coat pocket. He made a show of examining the artifacts. At last, Herriman reached the bottom layer. He revealed the mummy's face to be no fraud at all. Brown and wrinkled like parchment, it still appeared lifelike. In spite of herself, Dianella reached out to touch the skin. Realizing what she was doing, she yanked her hand back. No, it's okay, said Harriman. Go ahead. Touch him. Dianella did so and gasped. She expected the skin to feel dry and rough. Instead, it proved soft and supple. So lifelike, she whispered. That's the reason for the bandages, explained Herriman. The Egyptians wanted to preserve life, and they sustained Prince Neferaman's form, but allowed him to dry out, removed his organs, and stored them in canopic jars. He glanced around at the scientists who hung on his words. What if we could bring the prince back to life? Llewellyn scoffed, and Mitchell gave a derisive snort. Pogson narrowed his gaze, interested but clearly uncertain. Herriman produced a set of shears and clipped the rest of the bandages, pushing them away from the mummified body of the prince. Dianella's hand shot to her mouth. The action left no doubt at all about the mummy being male. Mitchell looked down his nose and smirked at her discomfort. Then the mummy's eyelids sprang open, revealing hollow eye sockets beneath. Mitchell stumbled backward into Pogson. The two scientists nearly tumbled to the ground. With a tick and a whir, the mummy sat up, rotating on the gurney as it turned to face the audience. What kind of trickery is this? This time, Professor Swift revealed his ire. Dianella noticed an incision on the mummy's abdomen. Herriman stepped around the gurney and peeled the skin back at the incision with a wet sucking sound. Inside, gears turned, cogs whirled, and springs throbbed like a heart beating. I've replaced the organs with clockworks. I can give the prince the illusion of life again. He glanced over at Dianella. This is why I had to wrap him in new bandages. I rehydrated his skin with special chemicals and ointment so he won't crumble to dust when he moves. But he has no spirit. Dianella shook her head. I feel no life from this thing. Herriman nodded. That's where you come in. Do you think you could summon Prince Neferaman's spirit, bring him back to the body, allow us to talk to him again? This is outrageous. Maurice Swift turned and flew from the room. You want me to summon his spirit in front of the very men who have derided me and my work all these years? Dianella put her hands on her hips, tempted to storm after Professor Swift. Harriman shook his head. No, Miss Stanton. I will only invite those to stay who will keep an open mind. He cast meaningful glances at Pogson, Llewellyn, and Mitchell. Mitchell shook his head, tucked his monocular back in his jacket, and, with a derisive snort, followed Swift from the room. Llewellyn clasped his hands together and bowed his head. I accused you of using wires, madame, but I confess I had no basis for my claim. Science is the process of learning, and if you're willing to let me sit in on a séance where you attempt to resurrect the good prince's spirit, I'm willing to retract my hasty words. Dianella put her hand to her chest, surprised at the scientist's offer. She nodded. Keep an open mind, and you will be welcome. Herriman folded the flap of skin over the clockworks. What do we need for you to proceed? A quiet, dark room, said Dianella. If you have some items the prince had in life, that would also be helpful. Several items from the tomb were sent along with the mummy. Herriman smiled and clapped his hands. He reached out and took Prince Neferaman's hand. Please enjoy the refreshments we have laid out. I'll prepare the room and summon you shortly. He led the mummy, ticking and clicking, into the other room. Dianella found herself glued to the ghastly sight, not really wanting to see the hip bones protruding above the mummy's sunken buttocks, but intrigued by the view none the less.